All right, so for this module, we're going to be looking at traditional communication. Some people, don't like to have our discussions split into traditional and contemporary, and they argue that in fact, even contemporary practice is still based on traditions and traditions change over time. But what we do need to have in our discussions is some kind of anchor point. And so we're using the terms for those reasons. If they're terms that you don't like, then that's fine. But make that argument for us, for instance, in your reflective pieces. Okay, so you're definitely allowed to have that perspective. So we're going to look at, this idea about Indigenous spirituality and how in a Western sense it gets seen as myth, the movement from dreaming to dream time. Okay, so one of the things, that we often see is in a Western sense, people talk about myths and they often relate those to children's stories. So they're not really seen as having the same power, the same impact as a history or a narrative. So we need to be really careful about referring to some of our traditional knowledges as myths. In the same way, we can see that a lot of Indigenous, so I mean that in a global sense, Indigenous belief systems, get reduced to some kind of lesser context than, say, Western religions. Okay, so we want to talk about spirituality in a holistic sense, in the way that it relates to things like creation stories. Okay, so there's an example here of the Pukamani poles from the Tiwi Islands. What sort of practices do they embody and what sort of stories do they tell? So we can see that terms like the dreaming and the sort of earlier iteration of the dream time are actually inventions of white anthropologists. Having said that, what you might find in some of your narratives that you're looking at is Aboriginal people who are using their own terms. But in general, it refers to, the beginning of the world, to the creation of spirits and ancestral beings, and how they formed the landscape. Okay, how they showed different areas, that were sacred, and also how that came to be embodied in different Aboriginal philosophies. Put simply, the dreaming is the blueprint for life. And many of these, stories, narratives, beliefs have been passed down over thousands of years. But it is important for us to acknowledge that the dreaming isn't only in the past. It's past, present, and future. Okay? So dreaming stories, come in different forms. So there's art, there's different customs, dance, music, totems, law, and also just in the land itself in the geographical forms. Okay, so you'll find an enormous range of resources that will support you in this. Okay, so let's look at a natural feature like a rock showing Tiddalick the Frog. Now, Tiddalick the Frog has probably been a favoured story, in your sort of early childhood learning in Australian curriculum. Okay, so, some probably slightly younger students may have been introduced to this yourself when you were at school. So it has a children's story to go with it. And it's been published in several different versions, okay, according to people's different levels of knowledge and their ability to engage with some of the themes. Okay. So we need to see, though, that these children's stories are also lessons for life, in much the same way as fables are in a European tradition. accepting that these are, for us, based in fact. Okay, they're not simply messages. All right, so then another example of a natural feature would be the Three Sisters at Katoomba, which also has a connection to a dreaming story, which talks about how three sisters were turned into stone during, a very early dreaming period. Okay, and so this is particularly an important story for the Gundungurra, and there's a link there for you to have a look and explore this further. So one of the things that I should say is that we've attempted to provide you with a whole range of hyperlinks for the course. You don't necessarily have to follow them, but to simply be listening online to me for an hour would be a little bit probably boring. So what we've done is we've provided you with other links that can fill out your time if you'd like to go more in depth. So we know that storytelling is central to maintaining knowledge and culture. Okay, and that Aboriginal cultures have been passing on beliefs for thousands of years through story. But then we can start to look at some different forms, like the film 10 Canoes, which are a contemporary way of us telling ancient stories. Okay, so if you've ever watched 10 Canoes and you can, you can view it for this course, you'll know that it's set in a couple of different time periods. What's also important for us to understand is that natural features like the stars also have their own dreaming. So things like the Seven Sisters dreaming, I think, is a particularly strong example. And it's interesting that even in other cultures, as far away as Europe, that those 7 stars are seen as 7 young women. So we know, for instance, that, for many Aboriginal people, the stars also, communicate seasons. They communicate times for different actions and ceremonies. And, they can be read also as a map. So there's a whole range of ways in which that natural environment, coming from a traditional basis, still provides power for Aboriginal people. We know too that nationally that there's a range of stone structures, which are said to map out, different star patterns and also movements of the sun. Okay, so these were ways of, again, communicating knowledge across thousands of years. All right, so I think one of the things that we need to open ourselves up to in this course is that we may be rethinking some of the knowledge that we've had. We may be learning some new things, and some of it may, be things that we already know. Okay, so a lot of students, for instance, in some of our introductory courses, may have been introduced to some of the materials that we're looking at. But what we're looking at in this sense is very much, from that narrative point of view. What is this telling us about communications? So Songlines, is another way that we can trace Aboriginal peoples and where they've moved. So, for instance, Songlines for Aboriginal people continue up into the Indonesian archipelago from Aboriginal people who went back with Macassan sailors and took their songs up there. Okay, so it's a really important way to trace the movement of people, but it's not just the movement of people. It's also the movement of spirituality and philosophy. It's also the movement of trade. So information trade is also, a really strong form of trade. Now, we also know that many Aboriginal groups had, a form of sign language, and it was particularly important in things like hunting, but also in mourning practices where you didn't want to say the name of the deceased. Okay, so, even facial movements can have particular meanings in Aboriginal contexts. Okay, so we've got some links here you can have a look at to see some examples of Aboriginal Sign Language. And again, for people, for instance, who want to be teachers, with the right permissions, these can be really good resources to bring into your classroom. Okay, and maybe to compare to things like Australian Sign Language, the standard sign language. So we can also see that, some of the forms of traditional communication are things like silence, okay, message sticks, music, painting, elder relationships, dance, storytelling, and different kinds of rituals, okay? And there's a link here to, a toolbox that can help you with some of those different themes. So next week, we're going to be, not actually next week, next module, we're going to be looking at communication in contemporary contexts. And this is our final module for our study in week 1. So we'll take some of the concepts from this traditional period and we'll see how they apply to us, today.